Hey there, thank you so much for tuning into FunAhead TV. Today, we're talking IMS bearings. Stay tuned. Okay, so behind me is my 2001 Porsche Carrera 4. It's of the 996 911 generation, and just like every other 911 of its era, except for the GT cars and the turbo cars, it has an IMS bearing. Now, I've had this car for almost a year. This car has just over 96,000 miles on it now, and over the winter, I replaced the IMS bearing. So with that, let's go check out the IMS bearing that came out of it. Like I said, this car had just under 95,000 miles on it when the bearing was removed. It is the original single row IMS bearing, the infamous design. The original dual row was also known to fail, but the single row was the one that was very infamous, especially infamous. As you can see, this bearing is in really good shape. I do have it mounted on the flange, just so it's easier to kind of display and turn it. But you can see there's no slop in it, and it spins very easily and smoothly. This bearing could have stayed in the car and in service a lot longer. But my car holds true to one of the main known modes of failure. It is a higher mileage car, and it's been well driven, it's been well taken care of, and those cars that have been driven more are less prone to failure. The reason is, if you drive your car less, you tend to get more oil contamination, meaning you don't have your car running as long, so the fuel that enters your oil during a cold start doesn't have a chance to get burnt out or evaporated out, and the IMS bearing does sit under the oil level. So, when your car sits, the oil does seep through slowly through the grease seal, and that fuel-filled oil will break down the sealed bearing grease, and then cause the bearing to fail eventually. And then the more driven cars, they don't have as much fuel in the oil, and especially if you change your oil out regularly and drive your car regularly, the oil that's getting past the grease seal doesn't harm the bearing. And there's definitely a lot of truth to that theory, I think, because there's definitely a lot of oil that came out of this bearing when I removed it from the car. It seeped oil for days after taking it out, and in fact I removed this bearing about 5 months ago now, and it still seeps a little bit of oil just sitting on my toolbox here. This, being the infamous one for failure, was in fine shape, and like I said, it could have stayed in service a lot longer. So now that you've seen the bearing that came out of this car, you know that even an old 18, almost 19-year-old single row IMS bearing with 95,000 miles can be in perfectly good shape, and like I said, mine would have continued to go for a lot longer. But it's kind of a double-sided coin, right, or double-edged sword. You just don't know. Especially if you buy a used 996, it's impossible to know. You can't just pop the hood and go check on the status of your IMS bearing. It's definitely a scary thing. Does it concern me? Knowing what I know now about mine, it concerns me a lot less, but I would say cautious. And I think that's how a lot of people should approach it. Buy one that's been well maintained, regular oil changes and service, and etc. And the odds are much lower that you're going to encounter a problem like that. So all rants aside, is it a big problem? It could be. How should you approach it? I would say with caution. That's how I approached it, and I'm glad that I did. It feels very good to know that every time I turn the key and start the car, I'm not going to have an IMS bearing failure during that drive, because I know the condition of that brand new ceramic ball bearing in that car. But that's not to say that if you just bought a 996 or if you've owned a 996 for years and years and you're just maybe starting to hear about the IMS issue, or you pretty much have to be living under a rock if you've owned a 996 for a long time and you haven't heard of the issue. But if for whatever reason you feel the urgency to run out and go replace your IMS bearing now, relax. It's fine. Just do it this winter or something. So, do I think it's a bad design? I think it could have been better, and I realize why they did it. They were having issues getting lubrication or sufficient oil pressure to the back side of the engine. And no, I don't think it's a bad design. I mean, I'm an engineer myself. I do automotive development, specifically engine development. And this is the IMS bearing is the kind of problem that wouldn't show up with extreme durability modes, you know, where you're running the engine at red line for 24 hours, or where you're driving it out on the test track, really putting it through its paces, or you know, any number of durability conditions, extreme hot, extreme cold. You know, young, I say young, like, yeah, young IMS bearings would not show those problems in that sort of condition. That's because no manufacturer that I can think of, I mean, not like I know what other manufacturers do, but I highly doubt that Porsche has a mode that they test where a car has sat in a garage for a year with old oil, and then they go start it, and then they sit it for a year again, and then start it, and then, or, you know, months on end, and then start it for, like, you know, to do these short drive modes. They do the opposite. Every manufacturer really pushes the heck out of the engine, looks at the stress on the engine, and says, okay, this passed. Well, you can't blame them. This happens. Manufacturers try to cut costs all the time, and when you consider the purpose of the 996, its intention was to revive Porsche to be a cost-effective 911 model that was going to be emissions compliant, hence the first water-cooled 911 generation. It was going to be emissions compliant. It was going to be more inexpensive, have more common parts, etc., and love it or hate it for those reasons. It succeeded. It sold more 911s than they sold more 996s than any other 911 generation yet, and it largely brought back Porsche. Then of course the Cayenne came out, then that really brought back Porsche. But before the 996, Porsche was dying, you know. So you can't blame them for cutting corners here and there. And I'm sure their, like I said, I'm sure their durability tests, their stress analysis tests, etc., all showed that that design would be okay. Of course, fast forward into the market, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, you start to see these vehicles that don't get driven often start to show numbers of engine failures in the market. So unintended consequences, but I don't blame them for it. I think it's one of those things that happens when you're trying to A, save a company, and B, cut a little bit of cost and still, you know, build an amazing car otherwise. All of that to say, is the 996 a bad car? No, not at all. It's every bit a 911 as every other 911. If you drive one, it will surprise you. It is so much fun. It handles incredibly well, and they're just fantastic cars. They're phenomenal. It's a 911. It is a 911.
It is a 911.
So, hopefully this video helped give you a little bit of insight on the IMS bearing. If it worries you enough, replace the bearing. Simple as that. Thank you for tuning in to FunAhead TV.
Dude. She's out. She is out. That's cool. Yeah.